Hey guys, tonight we begin with the shadowy world of science and horror that gave birth to Frankenstein. A tale not of lightning bolts and movie monsters, but of real experiments where corpses twitched, surgeons gambled with life itself, and an 18-year-old girl turned sleepless visions into one of the greatest horror stories ever told. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And in the comments, tell me what you're listening on tonight. Headphones, speakers, or maybe something more creative. I love seeing the little rituals everyone uses when they tune in. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the summer of 1816, the world forgot what warmth felt like. Snow fell in June. The sky, when not choked with ash-grey clouds, hung heavy with a strange yellowish cast like bruised parchment. Crops failed across Europe. Rivers ran high from glacial melt but carried little life. Families, even the wealthy, wore their cloaks indoors, and more than a few journals from the time mentioned dreams filled with thunder, fire, and cold. It was called the year without a summer. No one knew it then, but the eruption of Mount Tambora in the Dutch East Indies the year before had sent a cloud of sulphur so high into the stratosphere that it blanketed the northern hemisphere, dimming the sun itself. The world was quite literally under a veil of ash. It made the earth colder. It made crops rot. It made people uneasy in ways they couldn't explain. And on the shores of Lake Geneva, at a villa called Diodati, 5 souls gathered to escape the bleakness. They ended up creating something even darker. 18-year-old Mary Godwin arrived at the villa with her lover, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and their infant son. Their journey had not been easy, married in scandal, exiled by propriety, and weighed down by grief. Mary had already buried one child. That spring, just weeks before this trip, she had written in her diary, "I dreamed that my little baby came to life again, that it had only been cold." She would never forget that dream. Villa Diodati belonged to Lord Byron, who was already infamous by that time. A man as magnetic as he was monstrous, with a trail of broken hearts and whispered rumours behind him. Byron had brought along his physician, Dr. John Polidori, a man as eager for approval as he was tired of being ignored. It should have been a summer of lake swimming, poetry and flirtations. Instead, it rained. Day after day, the mountains around the lake vanished behind curtains of fog, and the thunder echoed so loudly across the water that guests sometimes mistook it for cannon fire. They huddled around candlelight and read German ghost stories aloud, their shadows trembling on the walls. Byron, bored and ever theatrical, issued a challenge. Each guest would write a ghost story of their own. Polidori would eventually write The Vampire, the first of its kind. Byron would start a tale and abandon it. Percy would scribble fragments, then drift back into his verses. But Mary would give the world something entirely new. She struggled at first. She wrote nothing. The days passed, and the others teased her for not having a story. Then one night, after hours of talk about electricity, reanimation, and the possibility of life without a soul, Mary couldn't sleep. Lightning cracked outside. The others had gone to bed. She lay in the dark, eyes shut but mind ablaze, and saw a vision. She would later describe it this way: "I saw, with shut eyes but acute mental vision, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir." That was the moment Frankenstein was born, but its roots went far deeper. Mary Shelley grew up in a house steeped in radical ideas. Her mother, Mary Wollstonecraft, was a feminist long before the word existed. Her father, William Godwin, was a political philosopher who believed in the perfectibility of mankind and often forgot to pay his bills. Their home was a salon of thinkers, poets and revolutionaries. Mary devoured books. She read Milton, Goethe, Coleridge and Rousseau. She listened to Coleridge recite the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner in her father's parlour. Its icy winds and doomed wanderers would haunt her own writing later. But she wasn't just a dreamer, she watched science too. In London she had attended lectures on chemistry and electricity. Her father's friends included physicians and scientists. She was no stranger to the era's most unsettling idea, that the boundary between life and death might be, under the right circumstances, negotiable. At the villa that summer, Byron and Percy had debated exactly that. What was life? Could it be reduced to a set of physical forces? Was the soul just a superstition? Could electricity reanimate dead tissue? Mary had heard about Galvani, an Italian scientist who made frog legs twitch with a spark, and his nephew Aldini, who took the idea further, shocking the corpses of executed criminals in public demonstrations. She knew the public had watched in horror and wonder as dead men's jaws quivered and eyes fluttered open under the arc of a galvanic current. Those weren't just rumours, they were real experiments. The late Enlightenment and early Romantic era were obsessed with the question of what animated flesh. Scientists didn't yet know about cells or neurons, but they had electricity, and they had bodies, usually from the gallows. In fact, just 13 years before Mary's stay at Villa Diodati, Aldini had shocked the corpse of George Forster, a murderer executed in London. The crowd had watched as the dead man's limbs convulsed and his face twitched. Some thought he might rise up from the table. That was in the newspapers. Mary read the papers. When she saw her hideous phantasm in that sleepless moment, when she imagined the stitched corpse on the slab, she was not merely spinning a tale. She was drawing from everything she had read, seen, heard, feared, and mourned. Even the name Frankenstein echoed the gothic thrill of her influences. It sounded Germanic, forbidding, foreign, but in the novel, Victor Frankenstein is a Swiss student of natural philosophy, schooled in the classics but consumed by his desire to pierce the veil of death. Mary modelled him in part on real figures of science, those who dared too much and paid the price. She did not describe exactly how Victor brings the creature to life. She left that vague, a deliberate omission. But the imagery is unmistakable. The spark of being, the instruments of life, infusing a spark into the lifeless thing. Electricity, reanimation, a body pieced together from charnel houses and dissecting rooms, a soul absent, a conscience unformed, and in the end a creator who abandons his creation the moment it opens its eyes. That last detail is important. Mary Shelley didn't just create a monster. She created a cautionary tale about the responsibility of creation. The horror wasn't just that Victor made life, it was that he ran from it. He recoiled in disgust. He left it to suffer alone. That might be Mary's most personal contribution. She knew what abandonment felt like. Her mother had died giving birth to her. Her father, while loving, often prioritised ideas over feelings. And Percy, though brilliant, was not exactly a model of reliability. He had debts, infidelities, and a sometimes chilling emotional detachment. Mary had buried 2 children by the time she turned 20. In Frankenstein, the creature learns language and ethics on his own. He reads Milton and Plutarch, he hopes for love. He watches from a distance, yearning to be accepted. When he's finally seen, he is attacked By the time he confronts his creator, he is eloquent but desperate. "I am malicious because I am miserable," he says. The novel's tragedy lies in that sentence. Mary finished her draft the following year. Percy helped her edit it, but the voice was hers. When it was published anonymously in 1818, many assumed Percy was the author. The language was too powerful, they thought. Too intellectual, too dark. They were wrong. It would take time for the world to recognise Mary Shelley's genius. But it began here, in a summer without light, in a house filled with storm, and in a mind haunted by both grief and wonder. She had witnessed the death of a child. She had read about men who shocked corpses into movement. She had slept beside a restless poet who believed in human transcendence and dined with an aristocrat who delighted in scandal. She had lived already on the thin line between the sublime and the terrible. And from all of it she conjured a story that still unsettles us today. Frankenstein is not a period piece. It is not merely a Gothic fable, it is a mirror. It asks what happens when ambition outpaces empathy, when creation lacks care, when science forgets the soul. Mary Shelley was 18 when she began writing it. By the time she was 24, she had lost her husband, buried 3 of her 4 children and become a widow. And still she carried on, polishing, editing and defending her story against critics who called it monstrous. It was, but it was her monster, and it was ours too. She never gave the creature a name, perhaps because she knew we would give it one. We always name the thing that scares us. Somewhere in London, a corpse jolts back to life under a spark, and the audience can't decide whether to scream or applaud. In the winter of 1780, Luigi Galvani was preparing dinner. A storm rattled the shutters of his home in Bologna. Outside, lightning stabbed the sky. Inside, a prepared frog sat on a table, ready for dissection in front of his medical students. Galvani's wife, Lucia, helped prepare the demonstration as she often did. She was a brilliant assistant in her own right. Then something strange happened. A metal scalpel touched the exposed leg of the frog, and it kicked. No heartbeat, no blood pressure, just a twitch. Galvani was not entirely surprised. He'd been experimenting with nerves and electricity for some time, but this reaction, seemingly caused by a spark from a nearby electrostatic machine, seemed to reveal something deeper. It was as if the electricity animated the frog's leg, like lightning awakening the dead. He called it animal electricity, a life force stored in muscle and nerves, independent of the soul, activated by a conductor. What he had stumbled on, by accident, would become one of the most unsettling scientific questions of the Enlightenment. Was electricity the spark of life? Galvani's findings set off a ripple across Europe. Philosophers debated, clergy blanched, and fellow scientists, like Alessandro Volta, weren't exactly thrilled. Volta disagreed with Galvani's theory. He didn't think the electricity came from within the animal. He believed it came from the interaction of the metal tools used. So he invented the voltaic pile, the first true battery, to prove his point. In doing so, he helped launch modern electrochemistry. But while Volta was trying to win an academic debate, Galvani's ideas had already taken root in a much darker garden. Luigi's nephew Giovanni Aldini had inherited not just his uncle's fascination with electricity, but his flair for performance. Aldini wasn't content with frogs. He wanted a bigger canvas. He began staging galvanic demonstrations on dead animals, oxen, pigs, even severed heads from local abattoirs. But that wasn't enough either. By the early 1800s, Aldini had secured permission to use human bodies. Freshly executed criminals whose corpses were still warm. If there was any moment the soul might linger, it would be here. and in the year 1803 Aldini took his most infamous performance to London. The subject was George Forster, a man convicted of murdering his wife and child. He had been sentenced to death by hanging. The execution took place in the early morning. Forster's body was then rushed, still limp, still warm, to the Royal College of Surgeons, where Aldini had assembled an audience. Not just any audience. This was the audience. Doctors, politicians, aristocrats, men in powdered wigs, and women with fans hiding their shock, or their fascination. It was society's most curious, crammed shoulder to shoulder in a candlelit anatomical theatre, waiting to see if man could awaken the dead. The body was laid on a table. Aldini, ever the showman, rolled up his sleeves and unveiled his instruments. Metal rods, copper wires, a voltaic pile gleaming with chemical energy. Then he began. He placed electrodes on Forster's face. A jolt. The jaw quivered. Another jolt. The left eye opened. One witness claimed the facial muscles convulsed with such violence that it looked like the corpse would rise from the slab. At one point the current surged so strongly through the body that it arched violently off the table as though trying to rise. Some members of the audience screamed. Others gasped. A few swore they saw the man breathe. For a moment there was no sound but the crackle of electricity and the hiss of sweat on metal. Then it was over. The corpse settled, still dead, still a body, but not untouched. Aldini later praised England's enlightened laws for allowing such experiments. He wasn't being sarcastic. In most of Europe, tampering with the dead was still heavily restricted. In England, the bodies of criminals, those deemed unworthy of burial rites, were fair game. This was considered progress, and Aldini saw himself not as a ghoulish necromancer, but as a man standing on the edge of scientific revolution. He believed galvanism could do more than shock limbs. He thought it might cure insanity. He dreamed of using electricity to reverse death. For him this wasn't macabre, it was noble. But to those who witnessed it was something else entirely. One physician described the event as a most solemn spectacle which filled me with awe and horror. Another noted that even seasoned surgeons left the room pale and silent. Rumours spread quickly. Had Aldini actually revived the dead? Or had the soul been briefly dragged back from the afterlife screaming only to vanish again? The church was predictably disturbed. Galvanism danced dangerously close to theological boundaries. If electricity could stir a corpse, then what role did the soul play? If a dead man could open his eyes and grimace under a jolt of current, then perhaps life was not divinely given, but merely a chemical spark. This was no longer science, this was heresy with a voltmeter. But Aldini didn't care. He toured Europe performing his demonstrations, sometimes on cadavers, sometimes on the mentally ill. He believed he could use electricity to restore sanity. Some of his patients, probably suffering from what we'd now recognise as severe depression, did improve slightly after galvanic therapy. Whether that was due to the current or sheer psychological shock, we will never know, and yet for all its theatricality, Aldini's work had a profound effect on public imagination. Because it wasn't just scientists watching, it were poets, artists, aspiring novelists. One of them was Mary Shelley. She would later cite Galvanism as one of the sparks that lit her imagination that night at Villa Diodati. The idea that perhaps a corpse might be reanimated through scientific means had by 1816 already entered cultural lore. Shelley wasn't making it up. She was synthesizing what she had heard, read, and witnessed. In her preface to Frankenstein, she writes, "Perhaps a corpse would be reanimated. Galvanism had given token of such things." That word, token, is doing a lot of work. She doesn't say proof, she says token, a hint, a signal, something whispered from the edge of possibility. The lightning that strikes Victor Frankenstein's laboratory is not merely a Gothic flourish. It's a nod to Aldini, to Galvani, to the entire generation of scientists who thought the line between death and life might be only a few volts wide. Today we understand a little more about electricity and muscle tissue. We know that post-mortem reactions can continue for a short time due to residual energy in nerve cells. We know that twitching doesn't mean consciousness. We've long since moved past the idea that galvanism can restore life in any meaningful sense. But the image of it, the body convulsing, the eye opening, the jaw twitching, remains. It remains in literature, in cinema, in our cultural nightmares. It remains because Aldini showed us something we weren't meant to see. That death is not always still. It may have no breath, no heartbeat, no soul, but under the right conditions, it can move, it can respond, and then that perhaps is worse. In the years following Aldini's experiments, galvanism became a cultural fascination. Artists painted scenes of electric revivals. Penny journals printed gruesome accounts of corpses dancing under electric arcs. Theatre companies dramatised reanimation on stage with wires and mirrors. The dead, it seemed, could be made to move again, if only for a moment. And yet even Aldini knew the limits. For all his hopes and grand ideas, no corpse ever sat up and spoke. No mind returned, no heart restarted. It was all gesture, motion, echo, but to a world still wrestling with the mysteries of death, gesture was enough. Enough to believe, enough to fear, and enough to inspire a young woman one stormy night in Switzerland to imagine what might happen if someone went one step further, if someone succeeded. In revolutionary Paris, the blade drops, and the head does something no one expected. It looks back. Paris, 1793. The city smelled of blood and burnt oil. Rotting meat wafted from butcher stalls in the Marais, mingling with the iron tang of the Seine. Streets were clogged with horse dung, flies and gossip. The revolution had promised liberty, fraternity, equality, but what it delivered most days was a show, and the star of that show was the guillotine. In those days, executions weren't rare, they were routine. A cart would rumble through the streets, a priest mumbling last rites, the condemned sitting upright with the pale, alert calm of someone watching their own dream unfold. The crowd would cheer or hiss. Hats waved. Bread vendors passed through as if it were a festival. Children were hoisted on shoulders to see. Then came the blade. It dropped with a hiss and a thunk, and the head tumbled into the basket. A moment later the body slumped, spasming sometimes, twitching like a puppet with its strings cut. And that might have been the end of it, if the head had stayed still. But on more than one occasion it didn't. The most famous case was Charlotte Corday. She was young, strikingly composed and calmly defiant. In July of 1793 she stabbed Jean-Paul Marat in his bathtub, believing she was killing a tyrant. 4 days later she was sentenced to death. Her execution was a public spectacle. As the blade dropped, her severed head fell into the executioner's hands. Then something happened that would spark decades of whispered debate. The assistant executioner, perhaps out of showmanship, struck her cheek. To the astonishment of the crowd, her expression seemed to change, as if registering indignation. Some swore she looked at him. That image of a severed head reacting, feeling, knowing spread through Paris like a chill. Soon doctors and scientists began asking a terrifying question. Does the human head remain conscious after decapitation? And if so, for how long? The guillotine had been introduced just a few years prior as a more humane alternative to hanging, beheading by sword or worse. It was designed for precision and speed, a clinical killing machine. But in trying to make death tidy, the revolution had unknowingly created the perfect laboratory. One Parisian doctor, Dr. Segre, began conducting unofficial experiments. After executions, he'd observe the severed heads carefully. Sometimes he'd shout the person's name, sometimes he'd shine a candle in their eyes. Other times he'd prick the tongue with a lancet, and he wasn't the only one. Another physician described lifting a just severed head and calling out the name. The eyelids flickered. The pupils contracted. The mouth trembled. Was this reflex or recognition? There were reports of lips moving, as if silently forming words no one could hear. In one case, a doctor held up a mirror to a head's nostrils and saw condensation. That detail made its way into the salons and pamphlets of Paris. And soon, every public execution was followed by another ritual, a scientific test. The revolution had turned death into a sideshow, and now medicine was providing the encore. In 1794, the German physician Samuel Thomas von Sommering wrote that he believed the brain could survive for 15 seconds post-decapitation due to residual oxygen in the blood. He wasn't alone. Several Enlightenment thinkers speculated that the head might retain awareness, if only briefly, because the blow itself didn't damage the brain, just disconnected it from the body. That's the part that made people squirm. If true, it meant that every person executed by guillotine might have had a few lucid seconds. Seconds in which they could see, hear, think, feel. In a particularly unnerving experiment, a doctor waited beside the scaffold and within moments of the drop lifted the head and held it in front of his face. He asked the head to blink. The eyes slowly closed, then opened. He asked again. They blinked once more. Whether the act was reflex or response, no one could agree. But the result was always the same. Awe and then discomfort. There's something uniquely horrifying about a severed head that appears to notice you. By the turn of the century, these tales had become common in Parisian drawing rooms. The guillotine, already soaked in political symbolism, now carried a deeper unease. It wasn't just a tool of justice or terror. It was a doorway, and no one knew how long that doorway stayed open. One of the most persistent reports comes from Dr. Gabriel Berieux in 1805. After the execution of a man named Tranquil, Berieux stood ready. As the head fell, he caught it in a cloth and called the man's name. To his astonishment, the eyes opened, then focused on him. Berieux wrote, "There was a distinct fixation of the pupils, a clear, conscious effort to focus." Again, was it automatic? Was it an illusion? Or was it something worse? Some scholars believe these post-decapitation movements are purely spinal reflexes, involuntary contractions of remaining muscle groups. The blink response, for example, might just be a final flicker of neural electricity. The flushed cheeks, a quirk of pooling blood, but others aren't so sure. The problem is, these experiments were done quickly, and often in the heat of a crowd, not exactly ideal scientific conditions. But that didn't stop people from speculating, and it didn't stop the stories. Across France, tales of blinking heads spread like wildfire. Parents told their children not to make faces, lest they freeze that way in the guillotine. Cartoons depicted disembodied heads rolling their eyes at executioners. Some began to believe that a person's final thoughts were trapped in their head, sealed like smoke in a jar. The image of a thinking head became a trope in Gothic literature. It's there in the half-spoken lines of condemned men. It's there in the haunted, expressionless face of the dead. Even in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, we glimpse a philosophical echo of this fear, not in the blade but in the question, where does consciousness end? The French weren't alone in this morbid inquiry. Elsewhere in Europe, decapitation experiments stirred similar debates, but nowhere did they become so entrenched in public culture as in post-revolutionary France. Because in France, death had been democratized and made theatrical. Executions took place in the same squares where people shopped for fruit. The guillotine stood like a monument to logic, clean, efficient, and morally neutral. But the heads had other ideas, and the physicians who probed their final flickers weren't just seeking knowledge. They were trying to answer a much older question. What is death? Not the moment of death, but the experience of it. Is there pain? Is there thought? Is there regret? These scientists, working at the edge of acceptable medicine, weren't just poking dead faces. They were interrogating the border between body and soul. And in doing so, they blurred the line between healer and executioner. It's no coincidence that the same era which gave us guillotine experiments also saw the rise of the dissection theatre, the resurrection man, the anatomist who turned death into performance. In a society obsessed with progress and reason, the body became a tool, a question to be answered by cutting deeper. But sometimes the answer looked back. Today, neuroscience tells us that the brain begins to shut down within seconds of oxygen loss. True consciousness likely fades fast, even if reflexes linger. But even knowing that, the stories of blinking heads still chill, because they remind us that the end is not always instant, that death might not be a door slammed shut, but a curtain drawn slowly, with just enough time to look around. That, more than the blade, is what made the guillotine terrifying. It wasn't just how fast it killed, it was the possibility that it didn't. Along the fog-drenched banks of the Thames, a body is pulled from the water, and someone reaches for a pipe. London, late 18th century. The River Thames was not yet the postcard of bridges and steeples. It was a working artery of soot and steam, dark with the wash of tanneries, shipyards and slaughterhouses. By dusk, the fog hung low over the banks, blending coal smoke with the sickly sweetness of decay. The sound of boots in alleyways mingled with the creak of moored barges. You could live your whole life within earshot of the water, and never once dip your foot in it willingly. Unless, of course, you were unlucky. Drowning was alarmingly common. People slipped, jumped, were pushed, or simply vanished in the dense fog of the docklands. The Thames swallowed them without prejudice, and for most of the century that was that. A body was pulled from the water, checked for signs of life, and if none were found, buried or forgotten. But in the year 1774, something changed. A group of London physicians came together to form a curious new society. Their mission was simple, and at the time slightly absurd, to save people who were apparently dead. They called themselves the Society for the Recovery of Persons Apparently Drowned. Later, with a royal charter, the name would be upgraded to the Royal Humane Society, a title that sounded far more official and far less like a particularly macabre fishing club. But behind the polite language was a radical idea. Maybe death wasn't quite so final, or at least not always. They believed that people who appeared to have drowned could still be revived if treated quickly enough. Today that seems obvious. We have CPR posters in every public building, but in the late 700s this was revolutionary. To act after death was, to many, an insult to both God and good sense. But the Humane Society did it anyway. They posted flyers around London offering 4 guineas, a respectable sum, to anyone who rescued a drowning victim and brought them in alive. They set up receiving stations along the Thames, small tented outposts stocked with tools to bring people back from the brink. And those tools were something else entirely. At some stations, a bellows hung on a wall. Beside it, a small tin canister of pipe tobacco. Then neatly coiled like a sinister garden hose, a flexible tube. This was not a fire-starting kit. It was a tobacco smoke enema. Yes, you heard that correctly. If someone had just been pulled from the river, pale, limp, breathless, the recommended treatment was to use a tobacco smoke resuscitator. a bellows that pushed warm smoke into the body in hopes of restarting breath. The theory, such as it was, went like this. Warm smoke was an irritant. It might stimulate the bowels, warm the internal organs, and jolt the respiratory system back into motion. And bizarre as it sounds, this was no fringe quackery. This was mainstream emergency medicine. The kits were installed in toll houses and riverside stations, available to the public. Early versions even came with instructions, like a Georgian-era defibrillator. Apply immediately, repeat several puffs until movement or breath resumes. It worked, sometimes. To be fair, some patients really were revived, not necessarily because of the enema, but because of the total effort, warming the body, clearing the airways and encouraging breath. But the tobacco, that part became legendary. Londoners, being Londoners, couldn't help themselves. Soon the phrase to blow smoke up someone's behind entered the local vocabulary, a joke rooted in this very practice, originally with literal medical meaning. Eventually it took on a more figurative sense, flattery, empty praise, or the act of puffing someone up for your own benefit. But while the joke stuck, the practice was real. Physicians like Dr. Thomas Cogan, one of the Society's founders, wrote earnest treatises praising the tobacco enema. He called it admirably adapted to excite irritability, which, yes, was putting it mildly. The Humane Society wasn't content with just one method either. They began experimenting with every tool at their disposal. Some rescuers used rolling barrels, placing the unconscious body on top and rolling it back and forth to simulate breathing. Others tried hanging people upside down, hoping to drain water from the lungs. Brandies were poured into mouths. Hot flannels were applied to the chest. Whips were sometimes used, yes, flagellation, in the hopes that pain might restore sensation. And then came the electricity. In the 1780s, a man named Charles Kite proposed an innovation, using static electrical machines to jolt drowned patients back to life. He wasn't talking about lightning bolts or Frankenstein-style galvanism. This was more like rubbing glass and metal to generate a crackle of potential. Still, the idea was the same. Life might just be coaxed back with the right kind of spark. Kite published a guide in 1788, an essay on the recovery of the apparently dead. It outlined several methods, including artificial respiration, warming and electrical stimulation, as part of a comprehensive revival strategy. He was serious, the society was serious, and the public was fascinated. Whenever a body was pulled from the river, a crowd would gather. People leaned in, breath held, as society volunteers unspooled their bellows and tubes. Children craned to see, vendors shouted over the commotion. There was something undeniably theatrical about it all. One moment a lifeless corpse, the next a shudder, a gasp, a cough, and the crowd erupting in cheers. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, but the line between miracle and spectacle blurred. The society began tracking its successes. They awarded medals, sometimes made of silver, to those who had saved lives using approved methods. They published annual reports filled with triumphant stories. A man pulled from the docks at Blackfriars Bridge, a child found floating face down near Putney, and scattered among those reports were instructions, diagrams, equipment lists, like some early handbook for reanimators. It's easy to scoff now. A pipe of tobacco and a puff of air seems more like a cartoon gag than medical practice. But the impulse behind it, the belief that death could be reversed, that science could override nature, was anything but funny. It was sincere, and it was terrifying, because beneath all the tools and terminology, these efforts betrayed a deeper fear, that the line between life and death was thin, maybe too thin. People began to worry about being buried alive. The fear wasn't new. Medieval folklore is full of tales of premature burial. But the Age of Enlightenment gave it scientific weight. Some inventors proposed safety coffins with bells or flags to signal the living. Others insisted on waiting 3 full days before burial just in case. What if death was not a door, but a dim corridor? What if someone somewhere could light a match and guide you back? Mary Shelley would have known of these debates. The Humane Society's reports were widely circulated. Newspapers wrote about its cautions for the drowned. Pamphlets featured illustrations of resuscitation kits. And in her own journals, Mary described dreams of warming her dead infant by the fire, praying it would come back to life. The idea that warmth, touch, or effort could reverse death wasn't fantasy, it was the science of the day. Even Victor Frankenstein in her novel begins his experiments with that premise, that life, once lost, might be restored if only one applied enough force, heat, or electricity. It wasn't a madman's delusion. It was what the Royal Humane Society had been doing publicly for decades. Not in castles, on the riverbank. One patient revived by the society later said he remembered nothing of the drowning, but vividly recalled the sensation of being burned from the inside. That, presumably, was the smoke. As time wore on, the enema fell out of favour. By the mid-19th century, artificial respiration and cardiac massage began to take over. The bellows were replaced. The society continued its work, modernised and adapted, but the image lingers. A cold, wet body dragged from the Thames. A crowd gathering, the air thick with curiosity and soot. A man kneeling beside the corpse, lighting a pipe, preparing the bellows, positioning the device. And then hope, ridiculous and grim, because for one strange moment in history, London believed it might save the dead by blowing smoke exactly where the sun did not shine. In a quiet Paris laboratory, a surgeon sharpens his scalpel, and a lamb's blood begins to flow into a man's veins. Paris, June of 1667. A young man lay feverish on a wooden table, stripped to the waist, his skin damp with sweat. His lips moved as if in prayer, though no words came. Around him, physicians paced. One held a silver bowl, another a delicate glass tube, and in the corner, tethered to a post, a lamb blinked, calm, unaware. This was not a slaughterhouse, this was an experiment. And the lamb was the donor. Dr. Jean-Baptiste Denis, personal physician to King Louis XIV, stood at the centre of it all. He had a theory, a bold one, that the blood of animals, especially gentle animals, might not only be safe for humans, but healing, transformative, even curative. With careful hands, Denis connected a narrow tube between the lamb and the boy. Lamb's blood began to flow 1 drop at a time into human veins, and the boy lived. This moment marked the first recorded blood transfusion in history, and for a time it was hailed as a miracle. Denis believed animal blood carried not only physical vitality but spiritual qualities as well. A lamb, pure and docile, might lend its calm nature to a troubled man, perhaps even restore sanity. After all, didn't blood contain the essence of life? The idea wasn't entirely without precedent. For centuries, blood had been seen as mystical. It was the substance of sacrifice, of lineage, of covenant. The Bible spoke of life being in the blood. Alchemists searched for its secrets. And every battlefield confirmed its importance. Lose too much, and the body failed. So what if it could be given? That was the hope. After his initial success, Denis proceeded to transfuse several more patients. One was a man suffering from extreme agitation and insomnia. Another, a young woman with a wasting illness. Denis recorded improvements in each. Word spread quickly. Pamphlets described transfusions as a kind of philosopher's stone, a method to rejuvenate the sick, soothe the mad, perhaps even delay death itself. Some speculated that if a man received young blood, he might grow young again. The salons of Paris buzzed with talk. Science once again had cracked open the natural order, but as ever, triumph invited tragedy. On his third major attempt, Dennis transfused a man known to be volatile, a troubled soul plagued by violent episodes and seizures. The goal was to calm him, to replace fire with fleece. This time the patient collapsed. He died shortly after. The fourth patient, a man named Antoine Moroy, died during the transfusion itself. The patient convulsed briefly and then collapsed. Later accounts suggested his body had violently rejected the transfusion. His body, unable to accept the foreign blood, shut down almost immediately. And this finally was too much. The man's widow accused Denny of murder. What followed was one of the most scandalous medical trials of the 17th century. Denny was acquitted, largely because Moroy's death may have involved arsenic poisoning, added later to frame the physician. But the damage was done. In 1668, the French government banned all transfusions. So did the Catholic Church. And just like that, what had once been hailed as a miracle became a forbidden art. But the idea refused to die. Across the Channel in England, another physician named Richard Lower had been performing similar experiments. Lower wasn't after spiritual benefits. He wanted to prove the mechanics of circulation. He believed the heart was a pump, the blood a medium, and that transfusion could be rational, measurable, repeatable. In a lab in Oxford, Lower transfused blood from one dog to another successfully, then from dog to human. In 1667, the same year as Denis's first triumph, Lower transfused blood from a sheep into a man. Again, the man lived. For a little while, but the Royal Society, though engaged, was skittish. They knew what had happened in France, they'd read the reports, and while Lower was more precise than Denny, he still had no way to know what blood really was. No one did. The concept of blood types, A, B, O, would not be discovered for another 2 centuries. To transfuse blood in the 17th century was to pour a stranger's life force into another's veins and hope, and the results were as chaotic as you'd imagine. Some patients experienced nausea, fevers, or fainting spells. Others went into seizures. A few died outright, writhing and gasping, their bodies reacting as if poisoned, because in a sense they were. Foreign proteins, incompatible antibodies, the immune system going to war with itself. They had no names for these phenomena, but they had eyes, and they could see that something was wrong. The Royal Society quietly discouraged further trials, and soon in both England and France, transfusion became not just taboo but dangerous, an echo of hubris, like Icarus brushing the sun. Still the public was enthralled. Cartoons mocked the idea of men turning into sheep. Satirical poems warned against becoming half-beast. In salons, people whispered, "Would a transfusion change your nature? Would you inherit the lamb's passivity or the wolf's hunger?" Blood, after all, wasn't just fluid. It was identity. The notion that it could be borrowed, or worse, mixed, tapped into a deep vein of dread. As the 18th century wore on, the idea of transfusion slunk into the shadows. A few eccentric physicians continued their experiments in private, but no reputable medical college endorsed it. Not until the early 1800s. In London, a young obstetrician named James Blundell had grown tired of watching women bleed to death during childbirth. He believed transfusion might save them, but Blundell learned from history. He avoided animal blood entirely. He insisted on human-to-human transfusion, performed with fresh donors and a more precise delivery system. And it worked, sometimes. He managed to save a few patients, mostly women suffering from postpartum hemorrhage, but he also killed several others. Without knowledge of blood compatibility, the process was still a gamble. Yet Blundell's efforts reopened the door. Throughout the 19th century, transfusion returned cautiously. Brass syringes were developed, glass tubes, valves and clamps. Medical journals began to track case studies, but the public never quite trusted it, because the horror stories lingered. Patients who convulsed and died in agony, surgeons whose faces blanched as a body turned blue, rumours of transfusion gone wrong, of men who changed, who developed animalistic behaviours, who became erratic, violent or strange. And always the same question echoed beneath it. Was blood just biology? Or something more? Mary Shelley would have known these stories too. Denis's trial had been a cause célèbre in France. Lower's notes circulated through scientific circles. Blundell's procedures were reported in the London press. Even in Frankenstein, the hints are there. Victor scavenges from the dissecting room and the slaughterhouse. He studies the principle of life, not just the mechanics, but the essence. He wants to control vitality itself. And what is blood if not vitality distilled? The creature's creation is never described in precise terms. Shelley withholds the method. But the aura of scientific transgression, of unnatural fusion, of interference in the sacred chemistry of life, it's unmistakable. Victor crosses a line, and blood, though never spilled in that moment, is everywhere in the subtext. Blood as lineage, blood as sin, blood as the currency of creation. Even today, transfusion carries a trace of this old unease. We trust it, because we must. We have the science now, the typing systems, the screening protocols. Modern transfusions are miracles of logistics and precision, but there's still something uncanny about it, that your survival may depend on someone else's blood, pulsing through your veins, carrying their antibodies, their iron, their immunities, that a part of another person now moves inside you. And centuries ago, long before antibodies had names, men like Denis and Lower saw the same truth and reached for it, recklessly. What they learned at great cost is that blood is not just red fluid. It is history, memory, identity. In a candlelit salon, a glass harmonica hums, and one by one the guests begin to fall into strange trances. Paris, 1778. The air inside the salon was heavy, perfumed, warm, a little damp from the press of bodies. Mirrors lined the walls, bouncing candlelight until the room seemed to shimmer. A few women fanned themselves lazily. Others had already closed their eyes. In the centre of the room stood a wooden tub, waist-high and rimmed with iron rods. The tub was called a bakeway. The man overseeing it wore silk robes, pale lavender, with silver trim. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if every gesture carried the weight of divine precision. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but commanding. His name was Franz Anton Mesmer, and the force he claimed to control, animal magnetism. In the years before the revolution, Parisian society had developed a peculiar taste for spectacle. Opera, automata, seances, science demonstrations, it was all part of the same buffet. Intellectuals might attend a lecture on atmospheric electricity in the morning, then spend the evening watching a clairvoyant read minds over champagne. Into this world stepped Mesmer, an Austrian physician with a gift for theatre, and an unshakable belief that he had discovered the key to healing all human suffering. Not a medicine, not a surgery, a force. Mesmer believed that all living beings were connected by an invisible natural fluid, a cosmic energy that flowed through the body in channels. Illness, he argued, came from blockages in this fluid. Restore its harmony, and health would follow. He called this force animal magnetism. The name was misleading. It had nothing to do with animals and only a passing relationship to the kind of magnetism known to physics. It was rather a metaphysical current, akin to gravity or electricity, but subtler, invisible, ubiquitous, and Mesmer claimed he could manipulate it. His treatments were elaborate rituals. First, patients would be gathered into a room dimly lit by candlelight thick with incense. In the centre sat the beke, a large tub filled with water, iron filings and broken glass. Dozens of iron rods protruded from its lid like quills from a porcupine. Each patient held the end of a rod against whatever part of their body ailed them: abdomen, chest, forehead. Everyone was linked by a rope or by hand, forming a human chain. In the background, a glass harmonica would begin to play. The instrument, invented by Benjamin Franklin, produced delicate, eerie tones by spinning wet glass discs. Its sound seemed to vibrate inside the skull, a haunting resonance somewhere between a lullaby and a wineglass's scream. Once the mood was set, Mesmer would walk among the patients. He rarely touched them directly. Instead, he waved his hands slowly through the air, as if shaping invisible smoke. He called this making passes. With these movements, he said, he was directing the magnetic fluid, unblocking their internal flows. But sometimes when a patient resisted the influence, Mesmer would fix them with his gaze, or touch them with a metal wand. That usually did the trick. Almost inevitably, patients began to show signs of crisis. Some trembled, others moaned, a few collapsed, convulsing on the floor. Women burst into tears or fits of hysterical laughter. Men screamed. Occasionally someone would faint entirely and need to be carried out. That's where Mesmer's valet came in. Stoic, muscular, always ready to haul a flailing aristocrat into the crisis room. A private chamber padded with cushions where patients could finish their episode in seclusion. Then, as the crisis passed, patients awoke dazed, but claimed to feel lighter, healed, renewed. Mesmer insisted these convulsions were not symptoms of hysteria, but signs of progress. The body, overwhelmed by the restoration of its vital flow, was purging its illness. The more dramatic the reaction, the more successful the treatment. Parisian society, being what it was, responded with a mix of enthusiasm and arousal. Women lined up for sessions, their corsets loosened, their pulses racing. Men watched with fascination, sometimes with jealousy, as Mesmer guided their wives into trances. His rooms became the hottest ticket in town. Even those who thought it all nonsense couldn't resist attending at least once. After all, the salons were dim, the music intoxicating, and the results, when they worked, seemed miraculous. Mesmer cured back pain, insomnia, paralysis, melancholy, or so he claimed. He even inspired literary rapture. The young Marquis de Lafayette wrote to George Washington, extolling Mesmer's discoveries. Enlightenment thinkers debated whether Mesmer was revealing a fundamental law of nature, or simply playing the crowd like a violin. Even Benjamin Franklin attended sessions, although he remained sceptical. In fact, it was Franklin who had helped lead the charge against Mesmer, albeit reluctantly. By 1784, the French government had grown uneasy. Too many influential people were spending too much time and money at Mesmer's salon. Too many women were fainting, and too many men were whispering about things that looked less like medicine and more like seduction. King Louis XVI commissioned a royal commission to investigate Mesmer's claims. It was no small task. The commission included Franklin himself, chemist Antoine Lavoisier, and physician Joseph Ignace Guillotin. Yes, that Guillotin. They devised a series of clever blind tests. In one, they blindfolded subjects and asked Mesmer, or rather one of his assistants, to apply magnetism to certain parts of their body without telling them when or where. In another, they told patients they were being magnetized when they weren't. The results were damning. Patients only reacted when they expected to react. Those who were told they were being treated exhibited symptoms, swooning, trembling, even when nothing had been done. The commission concluded that animal magnetism did not exist. They declared the effects to be products of the imagination and suggestion. In modern terms, placebo. Mesmer was devastated. He fled Paris in disgrace. His reputation never recovered. He died in obscurity, but his ideas did not. Mesmer's disciples continued his work, especially in Germany and England. His techniques evolved into what would later become hypnosis. The term mesmerize, still in use today, is a direct descendant of his legacy. In the 19th century, mesmerism was used to perform surgeries without anesthesia. In some cases, it appeared to control bleeding, dull pain, even for halt seizures. These accounts, though controversial, kept mesmerism flickering on the edges of medicine for decades. And in literature, the mesmerist became a stock character. The man with the commanding gaze, the hand that waves once and drops the body like a marionette, the puppet master of the nervous system. You see echoes of him in Poe's The Facts in the Case of Valdemar, where a dying man is mesmerized at the moment of death and lingers in a horrifying state of half-life. You see it in the Gothic archetype of the hypnotist, the spiritualist, the occult scientist meddling in the unseen. And of course you see it, dimly, indirectly, in Frankenstein. Mary Shelley would have known of mesmerism. It was still a subject of public fascination in the early 1800s. The salons of Geneva and London buzzed with stories of people collapsing into trances, emerging hours later with no memory. Victor Frankenstein is not a mesmerist in the literal sense, but his demeanour, his obsession, his seclusion, his quiet intensity echoes the figure, and the creature, awakening in silence, staring upward with yellow eyes and wordless comprehension, is the very image of a man pulled from a trance too soon. Mesmerism, like Galvanism and Transfusion, walked the knife edge between science and spectacle. It asked unsettling questions. What if illness is just blocked energy? What if death is not a wall but a curtain? And what if our minds are not sovereign but vulnerable, pliable, waiting for someone with the right words, the right gaze, the right will to bend them? That's what made Mesmer terrifying ultimately. Not that he fooled people, but that he might have been partly right. That imagination, suggestion and belief might change the body. That the line between healing and performance, medicine and theatre wasn't just blurry, it might be non-existent. Today, mesmerism has been swallowed into history. Hypnosis is still practiced, but mostly in therapy or stage acts. No one claims magnetic fluid anymore. No one builds bakits. But every time you see a hypnotist in fiction, every time a villain waves his hand and a victim collapses, every time someone whispers about energy and healing and the power of the mind over matter, that's Mesmer still making passes. At the edge of death, a physician squints at a brass dial, watching for a twitch in the scale and the soul slipping away. Haverhill, Massachusetts, 1907. In a dim hospital room, the curtains were drawn. The patient, an older man, frail and sunken, lay still on a specially designed bed, the sheets tucked tightly as if to hold him in place. Beneath the legs of the bed sat a precise industrial scale, its brass dial gleaming faintly in the gaslight. Near the footboard, watching with a notepad in hand, stood a physician with the narrow moustache, rimmed glasses, and the intensity of a man convinced the moment he had waited for was finally near. His name was Dr. Duncan MacDougall, and what he was watching for was the departure of the human soul. Sounds like something from a Gothic novel. weighing the dying. But MacDougall was no fiction. He was a practicing physician with a fascination for the border between life and death. In an era when medical science was beginning to embrace precision and measurement, MacDougall believed it was time to ask a question that had haunted mankind for millennia. Does the soul have mass? The soul as an idea was both ancient and persistent. For thousands of years, people believed that something left the body at death. An essence, a breath, a spark. Religions had mapped its journey. Poets had tried to name it, but no one had measured it. And MacDougall, steeped in both medicine and spiritualism, wanted to try. His plan was as simple as it was morbid. He would place dying patients on a specially constructed bed attached to a precision beam scale, accurate to within a few grams. The moment death occurred, he would note any change in weight. If something left the body, a soul, a life force, whatever you chose to call it, perhaps it would register physically. A dip in mass, a sudden lightening. In March of that year, MacDougall began his trials. He selected 6 patients, all in terminal stages of illness. Tuberculosis mostly. The patients were weak, bedridden, and expected to pass quietly. Each gave consent, though given the era's standards, it's unclear exactly what they understood. The experiment was clinical, cold. The patient would be placed on the bed scale. Their condition would be monitored. The room kept still, no drafts, no movements. And then, when death came, the scale would be watched breathlessly for change. And in one case, there was. MacDougall claimed that immediately after death the patient lost 21 grams. It was instantaneous. Not a gradual shift, not evaporation. A sudden drop, 3/4 of an ounce, less than a small coin. But enough in his mind to suggest that something had left the body in that exact moment. The soul, perhaps. He wrote about it cautiously, almost reluctantly. He knew how it sounded, but he was convinced. He noted that in the other 5 patients the results were inconclusive. Either the death was too slow, or the data corrupted by patient movement. But that one case, that 21 grams, it became legend. Before MacDougall even published his findings in a medical journal, the story had already exploded. The New York Times ran the headline, "Soul has weight, physician thinks." Within days, newspapers across the country picked it up. Coffee shop debates followed. Spiritualists rejoiced. Skeptics rolled their eyes. Scientists largely ignored it. But the public couldn't get enough, because it wasn't just an idea, it was a number. 21 grams, something precise, tangible, the kind of figure you could cling to in the face of death. It didn't matter that the experiment was wildly flawed. MacDougall's sample size was laughably small. His methods were crude. Timing death to the exact moment was, and still is, nearly impossible. The scales, though accurate by industrial standards, weren't immune to vibrations, air currents, or minor shifts in position. And even he admitted that not all his data matched. Some patients had no drop at all. One actually gained weight briefly before losing it. He tried to explain it. The gain was a muscular contraction, a shift in bodily fluids. The drop, he insisted, was not moisture or breath. He had calculated those possibilities. He ruled them out. At least, he believed he had. Modern science has since dismantled his claims. The 21-gram drop can be attributed to evaporation from the lungs or the relaxation of muscle tension changing distribution. Post-mortem changes can alter weight subtly, especially with such small margins. But the damage, or the magic, was done. The idea stuck. 21 grams became shorthand for the soul. Books were written about it. Sermons referenced it. In 2003, it even became the title of a Hollywood film. MacDougall didn't stop with humans. To further test his hypothesis, he turned to dogs. The logic, as he saw it, was brutal but clean. If humans lost weight at death and dogs didn't, perhaps that proved that only humans have souls. He conducted similar experiments on animals, claiming none showed the same weight change as humans. According to his report, none lost weight. Again, the sample was small, again their methodology shaky. But MacDougall took it as confirmation. Humans were unique. Something sacred left us when we died. Dogs, loyal, loving, innocent, were merely flesh. The public, to their credit, was horrified. Even in a more callous age, the image of a doctor killing dogs to prove they had no souls was hard to stomach. It didn't help that he had few defenders and even fewer peers willing to replicate the work. MacDougall faded into obscurity. He never published further on the topic. He died in 1920 with the soul still unweighed and the scientific community still unimpressed. But again, the story lived on because it was perfect. A man, a scale, a breath, a number. It felt scientific, it felt poetic, it felt like truth, even if it wasn't. And Mary Shelley, had she lived to see it, would have recognised the impulse. MacDougall was doing what every character in Frankenstein had done, trying to quantify the unquantifiable, to catch the soul like a specimen, to prove with weights and measures what had always been left to faith. The difference was that Victor Frankenstein tried to create life. MacDougall tried to weigh its exit, and both, in their way, came away haunted. Even in the decades before MacDougall, the idea of measuring the soul had taken hold. In the 1800s, various physicians claimed to have observed strange phenomena at the moment of death. One said he saw a flicker of light leave a dying patient's mouth. Another claimed a sudden drop in body temperature. Some built crude devices, soul traps of a kind, hoping to capture whatever passed through. A German scientist once filled a sealed glass chamber with photographic plates, convinced that a dying person would leave an impression on them, like a ghost caught in silver nitrate. None of it held up, but that didn't stop anyone. Because what MacDougall tapped into wasn't science, it was desperation. A desire to believe that something survives, that death isn't the end, that there is a measurable part of us, non-physical, invisible, but real. Even now the idea surfaces in odd places. Some argue that the feeling of a soul departing is real, whether or not it can be weighed. Hospice nurses, when asked, often say the same thing. You can feel the moment someone goes. Not just breath stopping, not just stillness, something else, an absence, as if the room exhales with the body. MacDougall never proved anything, but he left us with a number, and numbers are powerful, because when grief overwhelms words, we reach for whatever we can hold. 21 grams, not much, less than a spoonful of water, less than a hummingbird's heart, but if that's what a soul weighs, maybe it's enough. Enough to matter, enough to mourn, enough to measure, even if only once on a scale tilted gently toward the beyond. In a Viennese study, a man runs his fingers over a skull and claims he can feel destiny beneath the bone. Vienna, early 19th century. The room smelled of wax, old books and polished bone. Cabinets lined the walls, filled with jars, instruments and plaster casts of human heads. Some were serene, others contorted in anger or pain. One skull had the word murderer etched neatly beneath it. Another, philosopher. A man stood by the window holding a human cranium like a wine glass. He rotated it in his hands, fingers tracing the subtle ridges along the temples. Then gently he smiled. "This," he said to his student, "is where you'll find destructiveness." The student leaned in. The teacher was Franz Joseph Gall, and he believed he had discovered the roadmap to the human soul, carved not in metaphor, but into the shape of the skull. Gall wasn't a mystic, he was an anatomist. He dissected hundreds of brains, catalogued their regions, measured skulls with calipers, noted the curvature, the thickness, the peculiar swellings, and eventually he made a claim that would light up Europe like phosphorus on a damp floorboard. The brain, Gall said, was not one organ, but many, a collection of specialised organs, each controlling a specific human trait. Of ambition, language, courage, deceit, benevolence, rage. And each of these traits, he argued, existed in distinct physical regions of the brain. Like musical notes on a piano, each had its place. And just like a muscle, the more a trait was exercised, the more that area of the brain would develop. And as that part of the brain grew, it would subtly press against the skull from within, forming a slight bump or ridge on the surface. Therefore, by running your fingers across a person's skull, by mapping its hills and valleys, you could read their entire character. He called this new science cranioscopy. Later, his student Johann Spurzheim would give it a more fashionable name, Phrenology. At first, Gall's ideas seemed merely eccentric, but something about them captured the public imagination. The idea that human nature, once thought ethereal, unknowable, divine, could be measured. It was part of a larger trend. The Enlightenment had taught Europe to believe in rationality, mechanism, system. Electricity could animate dead frogs. Calculus could describe planetary motion. If the soul existed, surely it had a blueprint. Phrenology offered that blueprint, and it spread like wildfire. Soon Gall and Spurzheim were giving lectures to packed halls across Germany, France and England. They carried with them suitcases of plaster heads, each labelled with traits. These heads became icons of the movement, white busts with neat black lines drawn across the scalp, each segment labelled like a map. Amativeness behind the ears, cautiousness just above the temples, veneration at the crown. To the curious public it was a revelation. No more guesswork, no more prayer. You could know what a person was, what they were meant to be, simply by the shape of their skull. Phrenologists opened parlours in London and Boston. Gentlemen brought their children to be examined. Employers sent potential hires to have their heads read before offering jobs. Some women even brought suitors for evaluation, curious to know if the man courting them had enough conjugality or too much combativeness. In polite society, it became both entertainment and conviction, a parlour trick with the weight of destiny behind it. But beneath the novelty, something darker stirred, because if virtue could be mapped, so could vice. Phrenologists began collecting skulls of criminals, madmen, murderers. They built museums filled with casts taken from gallows and prison morgues. Each skull came with a backstory: strangler, thief, poisoner, and each was used to prove that evil had a shape. That deformity of mind could be seen in bone. This led to a kind of anatomical determinism. If someone had a large bump over destructiveness, were they doomed to violence? Could children be raised away from their own natures? Could they be shaped, resculpted through education and discipline? Phrenologists said yes. They claimed their science could help reform criminals, diagnose madness, prevent social disaster. That if you could just feel the right lump early enough, you might save a man, or know to lock him away. It all sounded so scientific, so hopeful, and yet in practice it was deeply unsettling, because it replaced free will with geometry, and morality with measurable fate. The skull became a map and a sentence. Phrenology began to inform decisions in courtrooms, schools and prisons. Reformers embraced it as a way to improve society. Politicians used it to defend policies, and inevitably, the science became corrupted by prejudice. Some claim that certain racial groups had naturally higher veneration or lower moral sentiment. Others used phrenological charts to justify colonialism, slavery and segregation. Bumps, once harmless curiosities, became tools of classification and sometimes condemnation. But even as it strayed into sinister territory, phrenology remained compelling. It had props, charts, busts, and above all certainty. In Edinburgh, the movement became especially popular. The city housed one of the largest collections of phrenological specimens in the world. Medical students poured in to learn the craft. Lectures were given in candlelit halls filled with bones. Among the many skulls collected, one stood out. The skull of William Burke, the infamous body snatcher turned murderer, who had killed at least 16 people to sell their bodies to an anatomy school. After his execution in 1829, Burke's body was publicly dissected and his skull preserved. Phrenologists were eager to examine it. They expected to find enormous destructiveness, perhaps enlarged secretiveness, or an overdeveloped acquisitiveness. But when they measured it, the results were inconclusive. Some bumps were present, others weren't. The data didn't quite fit the theory, but by then, the theory had taken on a life of its own. Phrenologists did what many scientists do when faced with contradiction. They reinterpreted the data. One even suggested that Burke's high benevolence bump explained why he killed quickly and painlessly. A kind of kind-hearted murder, if you will. Just here to tuck you in forever. Despite such mental gymnastics, cracks were forming in the discipline. Neurologists began pointing out that the brain didn't operate in tidy segments, that traits were not isolated organs but complex, overlapping processes, and that the skull's shape didn't reliably reflect the brain's surface. By the late 19th century, phrenology was falling out of academic favour. It lingered in the margins, slowly becoming a parlour amusement, a carnival trick, a relic of a more credulous time. The busts, those once sacred maps of the mind, were sold as paperweights and curios. And yet the idea never truly died. Even today you'll find echoes of it. Personality quizzes, handwriting analysis, IQ skull scans from questionable startups, apps claiming to read your brain through neural mapping. Because the promise still seduces us, that you are readable, that your fate is written not in stars but in skin and bone. Mary Shelley, again, would have been aware of phrenology's rise. In the years following Frankenstein's publication, phrenology was sweeping through literary and scientific circles. Mary, no stranger to intellectual debate, would have recognised the danger of its implications, because Frankenstein is, at its core, a rejection of external judgment. Victor's creature is judged by his appearance, assumed monstrous because of how he looks. He is never given a name. He is driven to violence by rejection, not nature. If a phrenologist had examined his skull, what would they have seen? Would they have blamed the murder organ? Would they have felt his misshapen brow and declared him doomed? Or would they have missed the simple truth, that what made him monstrous was not within, but the way the world refused to see him as anything else? In that sense, Mary Shelley's story becomes a quiet rebuke to phrenology, a reminder that no amount of measurement can explain the soul, that the mind is more than bone, that character is more than curvature, and yet the impulse remains to search the surface, to find meaning in shape, to pretend that if we look hard enough the skull will speak. Phrenology is gone now, filed under the long, embarrassing list of sciences that weren't, but its busts remain. You'll find them in antique shops and libraries, quiet white heads with labels and lines, promising secrets they can no longer explain. They sit on desks like ghosts, not of the people they were moulded from, but of the certainty we once thought we had. Deep in a smoky lab, a chemist lifts a red vial to his lips, convinced it holds the secret to eternal life. London, 1782. The laboratory smelled of mercury and rotting cork. Jars lined the shelves, some labelled, some not. The walls were blackened from heat, the floor littered with broken glass, smudged notes, and burn marks in curious shapes. A table near the centre held an array of retorts, crucibles and pipettes still warm. In one corner sat a small box containing bright red powder. The man who created it stood nearby, smiling. He was Dr. James Price, a young chemist with perfect posture and a reputation for brilliance. He had recently shocked the scientific world by claiming he had transmuted mercury into gold. Not metaphorically, literally. He called it the most important discovery since the Philosopher's Stone, and he had witnesses. Lords, scholars, goldsmiths. They had watched as he added the red powder to a mercury solution, heated it, and produced genuine gold. Not an illusion, not a parlour trick. It passed tests. It sold for coin. It was real, or so it seemed. For the first time in a century, a respectable Englishman was claiming to have done the impossible, to transform a base metal into something divine, to complete the ancient quest of alchemy, not in secret, not with spells, but with chemistry. And for a few weeks the world believed him. The legend of the Philosopher's Stone had haunted Europe for over 1,000 years. It was the sacred substance that could do two things: turn metal into gold and grant immortality. Alchemists, some real, many fictional, were obsessed with it. They worked in smoky rooms, surrounded by symbols, muttering over furnaces in the dead of night. Most of their claims were nonsense, some were frauds, but a few had laid real foundations for future science, distilling alcohol, isolating acids, inventing lab equipment. Chemistry, after all, was born from alchemy's ashes. By the Enlightenment, real science had begun to push alchemy aside. Newton, Boyle and others still dabbled in secret, but they were careful. To be seen chasing the stone in public was to risk ridicule, or worse, professional exile. But Price was different. He was young, charming, respected, and he insisted his method was not alchemical, but chemical. He'd simply found the right ingredients. The red powder, he said, was a catalyst, a formula he'd discovered through years of careful research. With it, mercury could be transformed into gold or silver, depending on the variant. He even wrote up the process and performed it before witnesses, and again it seemed to work. The Royal Society, prestigious scientific body, took notice. Some members were excited, others wary. Price was invited to demonstrate the experiment again, this time under more controlled conditions. They wanted a repeat, a replication, a proof beyond doubt. But Price hesitated. For months he stalled, claimed he needed more of the red powder, said he had to refine his process, that mercury was hard to source, that his health was poor, that the public was too excited, too intrusive. Privately he began to unravel, because there was no formula. The gold had been planted. The powder was likely just gold oxide, or a compound containing pre-prepared particles. The demonstrations had been sleights of hand, careful stagecraft, not science. Price had lied, and now the lie had grown too large to control. By the summer of 1783, pressure mounted. The Royal Society insisted on a public demonstration. Price cornered, relented. He announced a new trial. A small audience was assembled. The laboratory was readied, the red powder prepared. And then, before the demonstration could begin, James Price lifted a vial of laurel water and drank it. It was lethal, and within minutes he was gone, stunning the audience. Some reports say he staggered, others that he collapsed silently, but all agree on the essential fact: he poisoned himself rather than be exposed. The audience was stunned, the Royal Society horrified, the newspapers voracious. Price's suicide became a national scandal. the man who had claimed to create gold had instead made tragedy. And just like that, alchemy died in England, not with a bang, but with a quiet, fatal gulp. But the dream didn't die with him. All across Europe, throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, others kept the flame alive, sometimes openly, sometimes in secret. One of them was Peter Wolff, an Irish chemist and Fellow of the Royal Society. He was brilliant, eccentric, and deeply invested in the idea that the Philosopher's Stone might still be found. His London flat was a maze of alembics, furnaces, and glassware stacked so tightly that visitors claimed they sometimes lost their hats inside and never found them again. Wolff believed success required not just skill, but moral purity. He prayed over his beakers, engraved Christian symbols on his flasks, performed acts of charity before conducting trials. He died in 1805, still believing he was on the cusp of the discovery. Others chased elixirs of life, potions and tonics that promised not gold, but time. In the late 19th century, the French physiologist Charles-Édouard Brown-Séquard created a formula from animal glands which he injected into himself. He claimed it reversed aging. It didn't, but his experiments laid groundwork for hormone therapy, science sprouting from the mulch of pseudoscience. Meanwhile, quacks sold bottled miracles across Europe and America, patent medicines with names like Balm of Immortality, Vital Essence, or Life Elixir. Most were alcohol, opium, or both. Some were harmless, some weren't. Still the dream persisted, to drink a vial and emerge younger, to swallow a powder and cheat decay, to transform the mortal into the eternal. Mary Shelley, as always, saw it clearly. Her Frankenstein is not just a tale of electricity or anatomy. It is a modern alchemical parable. Victor, like the alchemists before him, seeks forbidden knowledge. He pursues life not by superstition, but by scientific means. He succeeds, and it destroys him. He creates gold, in a sense, a being more extraordinary than any natural birth, and spends the rest of his life running from it, hunted by what he made, haunted by what he dared to touch. Shelley had read the old alchemists. She even wrote another story, The Mortal Immortal, about a man who drinks a potion and stops aging, only to suffer endless grief as he watches everyone he loves die. She understood the cost of stretching life unnaturally, and she knew that no matter how modern the science, the temptation was the same. If you could live forever, would you? If you could create gold, should you? Today chemistry is real. We've split atoms, built up machines that see molecules, created synthetic drugs that rewrite DNA. But every so often we still hear the echo. In Silicon Valley, billionaires pumping themselves with young blood in the name of rejuvenation. In cosmetics promising to reverse cellular age. In pills marketed as biohacks to cheat time. Alchemy never died, it just changed clothes. James Price didn't find the Philosopher's Stone, but in the end he created something far more enduring. He gave us a cautionary tale, a young man, a red powder, a room full of expectant faces, and the sudden silence that follows when a dream proves fatal. Because sometimes the thing that glows in the vial is not gold, but the fuse. In a darkened theatre packed with strangers, a curtain is pulled back, and a corpse lies waiting for an audience. Leiden, Netherlands, winter, early 17th century. Outside the canals were frozen, icicles hung from the eaves of the anatomy theatre, and the air was sharp with wood smoke and sea salt. But inside, theatre was warm, lit by lanterns, scented faintly with myrrh and something darker, something sweet and metallic. The benches were packed. Students jostled for room, notebooks open on their laps. Behind them sat merchants, lawyers, barbers, foreign dignitaries, and a handful of well-dressed tourists who had paid good money for the privilege of watching what was about to unfold. At the centre of the room, bathed in lamplight and anticipation, lay a corpse. It was a man, not a young one, not old. The body was already pale and stiff, stripped to the waist, and draped with a modest cloth from the hips down. He had been hanged that morning, a criminal, perhaps a thief, perhaps a murderer. Few people in the room knew his name, and none were there to mourn him, because this was not a funeral. It was a dissection, a performance. The professor stepped forward, scalpel in hand. He bowed slightly to the audience and began. In the 17th through 19th centuries, the public dissection was a fixture of European medical education, and in many cities of popular entertainment. And nowhere was this strange blend of science and spectacle more pronounced than at Leiden University, home to one of the most famous anatomical theatres in the world. Built in 1594, the Leiden Anatomical Theatre was designed like a small amphitheatre, with steep seating and excellent acoustics. In the off-season, it served as a museum of curiosities, bones, wax models, preserved organs, fetal skeletons in glass jars, even a few mummified remains posed like dancers. But during the winter months, it was host to something more intense. Live dissection demonstrations, where the dead were taken apart, slowly, carefully, in front of an audience. It was both horrifying and deeply fashionable. Medical students came for the anatomy, tourists came for the thrill, philosophers came for the symbolism, and some came simply to confront death, up close, honest and irreversible. The atmosphere was reverent but electric. Music sometimes played softly in the background. Incense burned to mask the smell. Occasionally, a priest might open with a brief invocation just to keep things respectable. But once the blade touched skin, respect gave way to revelation. The body was opened layer by layer, skin, fascia, muscle, organ. Each part described, named and contextualized. The heart still red with congealed blood. The lungs collapsed. The liver heavy and waxy. The brain scooped gently from the skull like custard. And the audience watched, fascinated. Not because they were cruel, but because they believed what they were seeing mattered. They weren't entirely wrong. Dissection was the foundation of modern medicine. It revealed the hidden truths of the body: circulation, digestion, respiration. It corrected centuries of error, overturned myths, replaced guesswork with knowledge. But there was always a cost, because bodies, useful or not, do not come from nowhere. And in those centuries there was only one reliable source: the executed. In most of Europe, law dictated that only the bodies of condemned criminals could be used for dissection. It was seen as a final punishment, worse in some ways than death itself. For many, to be cut open after death was a fate more terrible than hanging. It meant no burial, no rest, no dignity. The anatomist, then, became a kind of secular priest, and a ghoul. This dual identity only deepened in the 18th century. As medical schools expanded, particularly in London and Edinburgh, the demand for cadavers exploded. But executions could not keep pace. The law provided too few bodies, so the supply chain got creative. Enter the resurrection men, also known as body snatchers. These were gangs of thieves who specialised in one thing: digging up the newly dead. They worked at night, often in teams. A scout would identify fresh graves, ideally of the poor, unguarded and unmarked. A digger would move the earth. A third man, lean and fast, would slip down, break the coffin lid, and haul the body up with ropes or hooks. They worked quickly. A good crew could be in and out in under an hour. They stripped the body naked. Clothes were considered property. Stealing them was a crime. But the body itself? Under British common law, a corpse had no legal owner. Selling it to a medical school, therefore, was technically not theft, just distasteful and incredibly profitable. Medical schools paid handsomely, sometimes 10 to 12 guineas per body depending on the condition and freshness. Resurrection men became organised, competitive. Some even took orders, scouting particular demographics or physical conditions. The public understandably panicked. Families began booby-trapping graves. Iron cages, called mort safes, were installed over coffins. Cement was poured into tombs. Watchtowers were built in cemeteries. Some families hired guards to sit by the graveside day and night for the first week after burial, until decomposition rendered the body less desirable. But still the snatchings continued. People began to fear not just death, but what came after. Pamphlets circulated with horrifying tales. Bodies missing from crypts, limbs found in garbage bins behind anatomy schools, grave diggers caught with sacks of stolen corpses. And in 1828 in Edinburgh, the fear became something worse. Two Irishmen, William Burke and William Hare, discovered an even more efficient method of sourcing cadavers. They killed them. Burke and Hare realised that fresh, undamaged bodies fetched a premium. So instead of robbing graves, they began inviting lodgers to their boarding house and smothering them in the night. No marks, no struggle, just a body, cool and quiet, delivered in the morning to Dr. Robert Knox, an ambitious anatomist at the Edinburgh Medical College. Knox asked no questions. Over the course of a year, Burke and Hare murdered at least 16 people, men, women, and even a disabled boy. Their crimes were only discovered when a body was recognised. A trial followed. Hare turned informer. Burke was convicted and hanged. In a grim twist, his body was publicly dissected, and parts of his remains were preserved as curiosities. His skeleton still hangs today in the University of Edinburgh. Knox, though legally untouched, was ruined. His name became synonymous with ethical blindness. He had not murdered, but he had not cared to ask. Mary Shelley, by then a widow and a mother several times bereaved, would have read about Burke and Hare in the papers. The story was impossible to avoid, and it echoed uncannily her own creation. Victor Frankenstein, like Knox, seeks knowledge. He robs graves. He scours the dissecting room and the slaughterhouse for parts. And crucially, he never stops to wonder who the pieces once belonged to. He sees only material. And so did the anatomists. They opened the body to understand it, but in doing so they erased the person, not always maliciously, often with reverence. But the effect was the same, and it left scars on society, on medicine, and on literature. Public dissections eventually fell out of favour. By the late 19th century, new laws allowed unclaimed bodies, usually the poor, the institutionalised, the forgotten, to be used legally. Anatomy became clinical, sterile, hidden, but the memory of the body snatchers remained. The shadows in the graveyard, the sharp knock at the door, the missing corpse, the cold table. The anatomist, once seen as saviour, lingered in the imagination as something else. Not evil, but indifferent. Today modern medicine owes its knowledge to those dissections, to those flesh and blood sacrifices. We understand the heart, the brain, the body, because brave men and women cut into the dead. But it's worth remembering the cost, and the questions that remain. When does death become anatomy? When does person become patient? And when does science stop being a candle in the dark and start becoming the scalpel? Mary Shelley didn't answer these questions. She just wrote a story, but in it a creature, assembled in secret from stolen parts, opens its eyes and becomes human, not because of what he's made of, but because he asks the one question his creator never did: why? Under a bruised sky, stitched from thunder and myth, a monster takes its final step, out of fiction and into legend. In the end, Frankenstein was never just a ghost story, it was a mirror, held up to a world that was already dissecting bodies, shocking corpses, transfusing blood, and chasing immortality through fire and fumes. Mary Shelley didn't invent the monster. She simply gathered it from the headlines, the lecture halls and the morgues, and gave it a face and a voice. The stories you've heard of surgeons prying into skulls for virtue, of doctors blowing smoke into the drowned, of scientists weighing the dying in hopes of finding a soul, these weren't imagined. They were real. This was the world Mary Shelley walked through. And it's the world we're still walking through now, though the tools are newer, the robes replaced with lab coats, and the question phrased in cleaner language. But the old ambitions remain, to cheat death, to map the soul, to hold in our hands the power of creation and perhaps destruction. Victor Frankenstein warned us, Mary Shelley warned us, not to fear science, but to remember what it costs when we forget to ask why. And with that, our story ends. Thank you for staying through the storm. Sleep well if you can,